The mountains carried a silence that was never truly quiet. Wind whispered through the pines, rivers sang against the stones, and somewhere in the shadows of the high ridges wolves made their calls. Life here was raw, untamed, and unforgiving. Folks who dared to live this far out knew the land didn't take kindly to weakness. It stripped the soul bare and tested the grit of every man or woman who called it home. And yet, in that wild, there was a strange kind of belonging, a rough beauty. Found only by those who endured it. She had not chosen this life. The widow had been carried into it by circumstances crueler than most. Her husband was gone, taken by fever during a harsh winter that refused to end. With the child already in her belly and no kin nearby, she faced the cold and the wolves with only her own 2 hands. She learned quickly that the firewood had to be chopped before the snow deepened, that traps had to be set if she wanted meat, and that prayers offered to the empty night did not keep hunger away. Each day tested her, and each day she forced herself through because of the life stirring inside her. Still, every evening when the lantern burned low, she felt the crushing weight of being alone in a land that gave no mercy. It was on such an evening that he appeared. A man carved from the mountains themselves, broad-shouldered and rough around the edges, carrying the look of someone who had long ago abandoned the company of townsfolk. His beard was thick, his clothes worn, and his eyes carried a storm that warned strangers to keep their distance. He was a mountain man, the kind mothers warn their children about, though not for fear of cruelty, but for the knowledge that such men belonged only to the wilderness. He seemed less a visitor and more a part of the forest, like he had risen out of the earth itself. And when he first crossed paths with her by the river, he studied her with a sharpness that unsettled her heart. The widow had been gathering water when he stepped from the trees. She froze at once, her grip tightening around the bucket. She knew. Men of this kind, loners, trappers, hunters. They lived by their own law, and many did not trouble themselves with the customs of the settlements. He said nothing for a long moment, only watching her, then finally spoke in a voice low and gravelly, as if unused to conversation. "You're far out here for a woman alone." His words carried no softness, but neither did they carry threat. Not yet. Her instinct was to turn away, to make it back to the cabin before the dark closed in. But the man followed her with his gaze, and something in it made her heart beat faster. He did not ask if she had a husband. He already seemed to know. He looked at the swell of her belly, at the strength in her posture despite her weariness, and then stepped closer. She should have run, but her feet rooted in the dirt as if the mountain itself held her there. The days that followed were restless. She saw him again, watching from a distance, always near enough to remind her he hadn't vanished. When she carried firewood, she felt his eyes from the tree line. When she mended the fence, she sensed his presence beyond the ridge. He was everywhere and nowhere, and she could not decide whether he meant her harm or something else entirely. And yet, the truth was plain. There was a steadiness in his gaze, a claiming that unsettled her but also made her feel less invisible to the world. The wilderness had swallowed her whole when her husband died, but this man seemed to see her clearly, as though the mountains had whispered her name into his ear. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of fire, he came again. Not lurking this time, but stepping right up to her door. She stood firm though her knees trembled. The fire crackled inside, casting light across her face. He looked at her, then at her belly, and his voice came deep and certain, roughened by the wild but burning with intent. "You're mine until you've had those children," he growled, every word like the strike of flint against stone. "The mountains don't forgive the weak, and I won't see you swallowed by them." The widow's breath caught, torn between outrage and the strange relief his presence brought. She did not know whether to slam the door in his face or cling to the protection he offered. His words were not gentle, not tender, but they carried a promise forged in raw survival. He was not asking permission, and yet he was not cruel. He was a man of the wild, speaking in the only way he knew, direct, unshakable, final dot in that moment. The world seemed to still. The river outside hushed its rushing, the wind ceased its howl, and even the trees stood quiet. Only the pounding of her heart broke the silence. She looked into his eyes and saw a man scarred by solitude, hardened by winters that would have killed another, yet carrying a strength that could shield her from the wilderness pressing in on every side. She also saw danger, the danger of giving herself over to a man who lived by no law but his own. Her lips parted, but no words came. The fire crackled louder as though impatient for her answer. Outside, night was creeping over the land, and with it came the sounds of wolves echoing in the distance. She knew the mountain did not wait for indecision, and yet she could not bring herself to surrender nor to send him away. His presence filled the room, fierce and commanding, leaving her caught between fear and something else she dared not name. And so she stood there, with the child stirring inside her, the stranger before her, and the wilderness pressing close. His words lingered in the air like smoke, a vow or a warning, she could not tell which. The night deepened, the wolves drew nearer, and the widow knew her life had shifted, though she did not yet understand how. The mountain had claimed her in its own way, and now, so had he, would she fight him? Or would she find in his rough promise the only shield she had left? The answer remained unspoken, hanging heavy in the mountain air as the fire dimmed and the night closed in. The widow's hand lingered on the wooden doorframe, her breath quick and shallow. She could still feel the weight of his voice hanging thick in the air, and though the firelight flickered across his face, it did not soften him. He looked like he had stepped straight out of the wilderness, untamed, unbending, and unwilling to walk away. She tried to steady her voice, but all that came out was a whisper that barely reached him. "You don't know me." Her words trembled, and she hated that they did. His jaw flexed, and his eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something she couldn't name. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like one would study a storm cloud forming over the ridge. "I know enough," he answered. His gaze flicked again to her stomach, then back to her face. "You're alone. You're carrying a child. And you're not built to fight this place by yourself." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they carried truth. She wanted to tell him she had survived this long, that she had. Split wood until her palms bled, hunted rabbits when her belly already slowed her steps, patched her roof with torn cloth when the snow tried to pour in. But the harder truth was that her strength had limits, and she felt them every time she woke in the dark to the cries of her unborn child's hunger inside her. She pulled herself upright, forcing her shoulders back as though her stance could fight off the storm he brought with him. "I don't need a man telling me how to live," she said. But even to her own ears, her voice sounded more like a plea than a warning. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more rooted, more certain. "It ain't about need," he muttered. "It's about survival." For the first time, she noticed the wear in him. His coat was torn at the shoulder, patched poorly with sinew. His boots were soaked with mud and cracked from years of weather. His hands were scarred, the kind of scars no knife alone could explain. The mountain had taken pieces from him, too, and maybe it was those losses that hardened his voice when he spoke. He looked like a man who had buried more winters than he cared to count. The widow turned back toward the fire, hoping he might read her silence as dismissal. But she felt him step closer, the floorboards groaning faintly beneath his weight. He didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. His presence filled the cabin like the cold filled the valley outside, total, consuming, inescapable. "You think this land will show mercy?" His voice was quieter now, almost hushed, but the sharpness had not dulled. "The storms will tear at your roof. The rivers will rise without warning. Wolves'll come down from the ridge when hunger drives them.
Lo.
And men worse than me will take what they want if they find you here. His gaze lingered on her belly and his tone hardened. But I won't let them touch you. Not while you carry that child. Something inside her shifted, though. She would not admit it aloud. Protection was a word she had not dared to hope for in months. Yet his way of offering it was no gentle promise. It was a claim, iron-bound and unyielding. It frightened her because it meant he was not asking if she wanted it. Her mind pulled back to the months before her husband died, back when the cabin still smelled of fresh-cut logs and the air still carried laughter instead of silence. They had come out here chasing a dream, carving a place for themselves in the untamed wild. He had believed they could build a life, a safe life, away from the crowds and the noise of the towns. She had believed it too until fever took him. In a single cruel week, leaving her with nothing but his axe, his empty boots by the hearth, and a child she now carried alone. The mountain man's arrival reopened wounds she thought had scarred over. He wasn't her husband. He didn't wear kindness on his face or faith in his voice. He was something else, rougher, fiercer, and frightening in the certainty that he belonged to no one but himself. Yet he stood before her now, speaking words that felt like a vow whether she wanted them or not. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire's pop and the distant cry of wolves. Her throat tightened. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice no louder than the crackle of flame. For the first time, something flickered across his face, something almost like hesitation. He looked toward the window, where darkness pressed against the glass, then back at her. His answer came slow, as though dragged from a place deep inside him. "Because the mountains told me." The words sent a shiver down her spine. They were strange, wild words, the kind that belonged to a man who spoke more with nature than with people. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as madness. But the way he said it, steady, unwavering, froze the protest in her chest. He believed it. He believed the land itself had pointed him to her door. She sank onto the edge of the chair by the fire, her hand resting over her stomach, feeling the faintest stir of life within. His words tangled with her thoughts, stirring both unease and something else, something dangerously close to relief. He didn't move from the doorway, as though waiting for her to accept what he had spoken. She knew she couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the night was too thick, the wilderness too near, and her body too weary to push him away. She finally whispered, "You can stay until morning." His eyes narrowed, but he gave the smallest nod, stepping inside fully now, closing the door against the cold. The cabin shrank with his presence, but at the same time, it felt less exposed to the darkness beyond. He set down the pack slung over his shoulder, the thump of it against the floor carrying the sound of metal traps and heavy tools. He did not ask where he should sleep. He sat on the floor near the hearth, like a wolf settling close to a fire. But never truly tamed by it. She turned her face away, staring into the flames, trying to quiet her racing heart. But even as exhaustion pressed down on her, she knew this was no simple meeting. His arrival was not chance. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name. That night, as the cabin filled with the rhythm of his steady breathing and the shadows danced across the walls, she wondered if she had just welcomed protection into her home, or a storm she would not know how to withstand. The mountain outside remained as it always was, vast and merciless, holding secrets in its ridges and rivers. And now, so did her. Cabined in the darkness, with the fire burning low, she whispered a prayer she had not spoken since her husband's passing, asking for strength, for safety, for a sign of what was to come. The silence that followed was deep. So deep it felt as though the mountains themselves were listening. When sleep finally crept over her, she dreamt of snow falling heavy, of wolves circling near, and of a shadowed figure standing between her and the wild, his voice echoing like thunder in the night. growling the same words he had spoken by her door dot, and as dawn threatened to rise, painting the peaks with cold light, the widow awoke with the uneasy knowledge that her life was no longer hers alone. It was bound now to a man she did not understand, a man who carried the wilderness in his very bones. What that bond meant, she did not yet know, but she could feel it pressing against her like the weight of the mountains themselves, unshakable, immovable, waiting for the day it would reveal its full strength. Morning came gray and cold, with frost stitched across the window like lace. She woke to the sound of metal, a careful clatter that told her the mountain man was already moving. He had the door cracked open and was testing a trap on the porch, hands quick and sure despite the chill. Steam rose from a kettle he had set on the coals, and the scent of boiled pine needles drifted through the room. He glanced at her and nodded once, as though they had struck a bargain in the night. She felt the weight of that look more than any. "Spoke an oath. You shouldn't be lifting heavy," he said, as she started toward the woodpile stacked inside. "Your back will give. The river ice isn't strong yet either. No water fetching unless I'm there." The words came like orders, and her jaw tightened, but the fear in her body was real. She hated how much she needed the help, how good it felt to hear someone say you shouldn't do this and know they'd do it for you. Survival pressed close on both sides of pride. She decided to let him carry the wood for now. The kettle hissed. He poured the hot water into a cup and added something from a leather pouch. "Spruce tips," he said. "Keep sickness off." He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. "You and the child will drink this in the mornings." She sipped and tried not to wince at the resin taste. Her gaze slid to the pack he had brought in. Beside the traps and tools lay 2 thick pelts, a coil of rope, and a small tin box scarred by heat. She wondered what a man carried in a fire-scarred box but didn't ask. He had the air of someone who answered only what he chose. He went out to check the line of snares he had set during the first gray light. The widow stirred the embers and forced herself to focus on chores. She trimmed the wicks, swept ash from the hearth, and measured the last of the beans. Her stores were thinner than she wanted to admit. If the winter turned cruel again, there would be days when hunger pressed hard. By noon the wind picked up. She heard his boots on the porch and opened the door to find him with snow dusting his hair and shoulders. He carried 2 rabbits and a sour look. "Tracks," he said, stepping inside. He dropped the rabbits on the table, then leaned close to the window and peered out toward the timber. "Not wolves, man." She felt the floor tilt under her. "Traders?" "No," he answered, voice roughened. "Traders leave sign different. These cut low and wide. 3 sets, maybe 4. Moving quiet. One of them drags a left foot." He paused. "I know that drag." She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "You know them." "I know the kind," he said. After a breath he added, "And I know one." He wouldn't say more, not then. He skinned the rabbits and set them to stew, then took his rifle, checked the sight, and went back out to walk the ridge behind the cabin. He moved the way a river moves around stones, smooth and without wasted motion. She watched the line of his shoulders, the way he kept his body between the timber and the cabin as if he were a wall she had not asked for but could not refuse. That afternoon, the sky lowered. He returned with a thin branch marked by a strip of cloth. He dropped it on the table. The cloth was red, the dye run thin by weather. "This was tied to a spruce near the ravine," he said. "It means a meeting place. Means they'll be back." She stared at the cloth, her heart thudding. "Who are they?" "Men who take what they want from what the mountain has already taken," he said, eyes hard. "They run traps that don't belong to them. They mark cabins that look alone. They trade furs for whiskey, then use the whiskey to sharpen their courage. They hunted in my range last winter and got driven out. A man who drags his left foot lost that fight. He holds a debt." She felt a cold rise from the floor and settle in her bones. He was not only here for protection. He was drawn by old trouble with new boots. She tried to find her voice. "You brought this to my door." His eyes flicked to her belly and then to the window. "I brought myself," he said. "They would have come sooner or later. Winter squeezes the worst out of men. But I'll be here when they do." She wanted to tell him to leave, to take his storms and debts with him. Instead, she stirred the stew and said nothing. The mountain did not deal in wishes. It dealt in firewood, water, food, and the luck of who found you first as night fell. He barred the door with a heavy beam she had never used alone. He set a second beam across the back window and stacked extra wood inside by the hearth. He handed her his hunting knife and showed her the angle to hold it, the way to brace a shoulder behind a shove. The lessons burned into her fingers as surely as fire. She could not decide whether to be grateful or afraid. Later, when the wind quieted, he opened the tin box. Inside lay a folded map, a small iron star with its pin broken, a lock of hair bound with blue thread, and a hammered coin bent nearly in half. He held the coin between his thumb and forefinger as if weighing it. "My brothers," he said. "They ambushed us in the high draw last winter. We trapped beaver where the creek braided under ice. He went down first." He set the coin back in the box, then met her eyes. The one with the bad foot was there. He laughed. "I still hear it." The widow's throat worked and no sound came. She thought of her husband, of the fever that had stolen him without a fight to wage. Grief had no sharp edges left in her. It was a dull ache that lived in her chest and woke with her each day. But the pain in the mountain man's voice was a blade kept toned. "You carry a star," she said quietly, nodding to the iron. "Were you law once?" "I tried to be," he said, closing the tin. "But the ridge has its own law. Sometimes it is only this who stands and who runs." He looked toward the door. "I didn't come here to run." They settled into a grim routine. At dawn he ranged out, moving in broad loops, reading sign and circling back by noon. In the afternoons he cut wood and mended the roof and salted meat while she sewed, cooked, and kept the fire strong. Every task was a small act of defiance against the cold, a promise to the child pressing beneath her ribs. At night he sat by the door with the rifle across his knees and told her how the river turned treacherous where a shelf of ice hid thin water. He taught her the call of a jay that meant hawk and the softer cry that meant man. He never softened his words, but his voice gentled when her hand went to her back or when the baby rolled hard enough to make her catch her breath. Sometimes, as she watched him, the widow saw pieces of the man he must have been before the mountain took hold of him. He tended the snare lines with care, thanked the rabbits under his breath, and left food in a split stump for a red fox that had begun to shadow the edges of the cabin. A part of him still honored things other men forgot. On the third day, she saw smoke over the far ridge. Not a cook fire or a settler's chimney. It rose in a thin, dark thread from the draw he had called the bad place. He was already shouldering his rifle. "I won't be far," he said, though both of them knew distance in the mountains measured more than miles. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then reached into his pack and drew out a small handbell, brass gone green along the rim. He pressed it into her palm. "If you hear something you don't like, ring once. I'll be listening." She wanted to ask how he could hear a bell across frozen timber and wind, but the question died when she met his gaze. The answer was simple. He would hear because he had decided he must not with him gone. The cabin grew too quiet. The widow kept herself busy, kneading dough for biscuits, mending the slit in her only warm skirt, stacking kindling until her back ached. Late afternoon light slid through the window and turned the dust gold. That was when she heard it. A crow call from the ridge, too sharp, repeated twice, then silence. She moved to the window. Nothing stirred but the pines. The handbell lay cool. In her grip, she did not ring it. Instead, she lifted the latch and stepped onto the porch, careful of the uneven boards he had warned her about. The air tasted like iron before snow. She scanned the tree line. A shape shifted at the edge of the timber. Another joined it. 4 men moving slow and wide, just like he had said. The last one dragged his left foot. Her breath went thin. She backed into the cabin, latched the door, and set the beam. She took her place by the hearth where he had shown her, knife in reach. The men did not come down at once. They took their time, circling, testing. She heard a twig snap near the back window. She heard a whistle, low and ugly. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for a moment when the door might give. She waited for the bell to do its work, but doubt gnawed at her. What if the wind carried the sound away? What if he had gone too far? What if he could not come? A rock hit the side of the cabin with a dull thud. Another followed. A voice called out, mocking and mean, "Hello, the house. Cold season. Thought you might be grateful for company." She went cold and hot all at once. Her hand found the bell again. She rang it once, sharp. The sound seemed to vanish into the weather. Silence returned. Then she heard a second sound, faint but real, the answering cry of a jay from deep in the trees. Relief washed her knees weak. The men came anyway. The first tested the door, then pressed harder. The beam held. A second moved toward the window with a knife to pry the shutter. She fixed her eyes on the crack under the door and remembered the angle he had taught her. If they broke through, she would strike and step and strike again. Keep them bottled in the narrow entry where numbers meant less. Boot steps crunched on the snow. The window latch scraped. She felt the child turn, as if the baby itself knew the world was pressing too close. The mountain man did not burst from the trees like a hero from a tale. The forest gave up no sound until the men froze at once, 3 faces turning toward the ridge. She heard a voice like a low growl carry across the yard, "Leave the door." One of the men laughed. "You again?" A pause, then an answer like a warning rumble before a storm. "You limped when last I saw you. I can give you a second reason to drag your leg." The widow couldn't see him from the window's angle, but she saw his shadow stretch long across the snow, saw how the men shifted as if the ground had tilted. The one with the bad foot spat. "That coin you keep for your dead won't buy her from us." Her stomach flipped. She had not known about the coin's rumor. She had not known these men knew about her. Anger steadied her breathing. "What do you want?" the mountain man asked, all the heat gone from his voice. "What we always want," the limping man said. "Food, pelts, firearms if you keep extras, and a warm cabin when we pass this way." His grin showed in the frost. "Maybe we stay a while. We can do a lot of good for a woman alone." "She isn't alone," the mountain man said. A long beat hung in the cold. The men's laughter faltered. The one at the window slid his knife back into his belt. "Then come into the open," the limping man said, "and we'll speak like friends." "I speak just fine from here," the mountain man said. "You turn around and walk. Leave your snares. Leave that red strip you hung on a spruce. If I find you south of the draw again, I will bury what the wolves don't take." The limping man lifted his arms in a mock shrug. "Threats freeze easy in this weather. Maybe you shoot one of us." "What then?" "You still face the snow and the wolves and the hunger the widow has yet to feel. You can't hold a door against winter itself." No answer came. The trees held their breath. Then, clear and calm, the mountain man said, "You're right." He let the words hang, soft as snow. "Which is why I brought winter with me." The widow did not understand until she heard the crack above the man, a sound like thick ice breaking on a river. Another crack followed. He had cut a long dead tree days ago and scored it shallow at the base, leaving it leaning into a nest of smaller trunks. A rope ran from the notch to a pine behind the cabin, buried under snow and pulled tight now by a hand she could not see. The dead tree groaned and tipped, sweeping a wide arc. The men scattered, but the limping man moved slow. Snow exploded across the yard as branches crashed down, and the rope sang against the pine. When the smoke and white settled, the men had retreated to the trees. One cursed and held his arm. The limping man stared at the fallen trunk, breath steaming. "Heavy. This place is marked," he called. "You can't guard it forever." "Long enough," the mountain man answered. The men slipped back into the timber. Silence returned, full and heavy. The widow's fingers shook against the bell. She did not open the door. She waited, knife in reach, counting her breaths. When the mountain man came in from the back, snow streaked his coat. He looked at her, at the knife, at the set of her jaw, and he nodded once, almost with respect. "They'll return," he said. "No," she answered. Her voice felt steadier than she expected. "Why didn't you shoot?" "Because bullets are loud and few," he said, setting the rifle by the door. "And because we need to know who comes with them next time. There's always someone new when men like that want to prove themselves." He stoked the fire with short, controlled motions. Neither spoke again for a long while. The child rolled once more and settled. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and relentless, hiding tracks, covering the lean tree that had torn the yard, smoothing every rough edge as if the land wanted to hide the truth of what it had witnessed. Before sleep, the widow took the iron star from the tin and set it on the mantel. She did it without asking, and he watched her without comment. The star had no pin, no legal weight in these hills, but its shape caught the firelight. It stood for a line, thin and stubborn, a line they would try to hold. In the night she dreamed of corridors of white, of branches bending under burden, of a bell ringing once and echoing through the ridge as if the mountain itself were a great hollow shell. She woke to the sound of a fox barking near the porch, and the faint scent of smoke from far away. Someone had lit a fire beyond the draw, beyond where the fallen trunk lay. Others had come dot by dawn. There were new prints in the snow near the creek, too many to count. The mountain man's mouth set. "Hard. They brought friends," he said, scanning the ridge. He checked the rifle and the rope lines and added a second bar to the back door he had fashioned in the night from an old yoke. She tested the beam with her palm and felt how solid it was. He handed her the bell again. "I may have to draw them." "Out," he said, eyes on the tree line. "If they split, some will try the cabin while the rest chase me. You will hold this door like it's the only cliff above a river." "It is," she said. He paused, then gave her one of those small, rare nods. "Keep the iron star where you set it," he added. "Not for them, for you." "What about you?" she asked. He slid the bent coin into his coat pocket and closed his hand around it. "I have winter." She almost smiled at the mild madness of that faith. Then the wind shifted, carrying the far-off sound of men shouting orders and the sharp whine of a saw biting wood. They were cutting poles to make a blind or a ram. Their patience had thinned. He stepped onto the porch and looked back at her. For a heartbeat, his fierce expression softened. Something moved behind his eyes that might have been hope or might have been warning. He touched the doorframe where her fingers had rested the first night. Then he went down the steps and into the falling snow. The widow set the beam, lifted the knife, and felt the child nudge her ribs like a small fist urging her to stand fast. She listened to the saw sing, and the voices rise and the forest answer in its old hard tongue. The mountain had chosen its hour. The men beyond the trees had chosen theirs. Now the line would be tested, and the star on the mantel threw thin light against the wall as if it knew that whatever came next would decide more than a single winter, Snow fell heavy that morning, swallowing the sound of the world until even her own breath seemed too loud. The widow pressed her palm against the beam bracing the door, feeling the weight of the mountain and the men beyond it. Each hour crawled like a wounded animal. The mountain man had gone out at first light, vanishing into the trees with his rifle across his back and the bent coin tucked inside his coat. He had not said how long he would be gone. He had only touched the frame of the door once more, then left her with the bell in her hand. She tried to keep busy, but the silence pressed close. She baked biscuits, swept the floor though it did not need sweeping, and watched the iron star glint faintly above the mantel. The child turned inside her, restless, as though it could sense the storm that brewed outside. Now and then, she thought, she heard a faint sound carried on the wind, but when she stilled herself, there was nothing but the creak of the cabin walls. By mid-morning, she saw smoke rising again beyond the draw. Thicker now, darker. The men had built a camp, and where there was a camp there was fire enough to melt the frost off courage. She set her jaw and checked the shutters one more time. The knife lay by her side. She tried to hold on to the thought that he was near, listening for her bell, but the emptiness of the timber made her doubt. When the sound finally came, it was not the sharp call of a jay or the low growl of his voice. It was the thud of axes. The men were cutting more than poles. They were shaping logs, driving them with curses and grunts. She imagined them binding a ram, something heavy enough to break the beam of her door. Each strike echoed inside her chest. Late. In the day, she heard another sound. A rifle cracked in the distance. Once, twice. The shouts that followed rose like startled crows, then fell away. She moved to the window, her heart climbing into her throat. The forest hid all. She gripped the bell but did not ring. If it was him, he would come. If it was not, then sound would only hasten what she dreaded. As dusk thickened, the mountain man appeared at the edge of the yard. His coat was torn at the sleeve and blood streaked his cheek, but his stride was steady. Relief flooded her so sharp she had to grip the wall to stand. He came to the porch, eyes fierce, and barred the door behind him. "They know I'm here," he said, voice low. "I took one of their rifles and scattered the rest, but it won't hold them long. They've called more from beyond the ridge. By tomorrow night there may be 10. Her stomach clenched. 10 against us? 10 against a door and the winter, he said, setting the rifle by the hearth. He laid the stolen gun beside it. They'll come with torches if the ram fails. Fire eats faster than hunger. She went cold. Fire was worse than steel, worse than the hunger of wolves. Fire turned walls into nothing but ash. What will we do? He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw the weight of every winter he had survived. We'll give them reason to fear the dark before it swallows us all. That night they sat together, neither speaking much. He checked the traps he had laid close to the cabin, small snares turned into warnings. He strung lines with bits of tin that would rattle if touched. She mended his sleeve where blood had stiffened the cloth. The child shifted again, and he glanced at her hand pressed against her belly. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The fire burned low. She heard a whistle outside. Mocking, drawn out. Another followed. The men were circling. The mountain man motioned her silent and took his place by the door. Hours passed like stone grinding on stone. At last the sounds faded, and only the whisper of snow remained. Before dawn, the mountain man woke her with a touch to her shoulder. His face was drawn, eyes hollow but steady. "Today," he said simply. "They'll come today." The widow rose and tied her hair back with shaking fingers. She set water to boil and placed the biscuits from yesterday on the table, though neither of them ate. The bell lay within her reach, the knife beside it. She felt the iron star watching from the mantel. By mid-morning, the first sign came, A crow burst from the trees, cawing wild. Then the crunch of many boots on snow. Shadows flickered between. Trunks, growing thicker, closer. She saw movement at the ridge, shapes dragging something heavy. A log. 2 men on either side carried it, the limp-footed one guiding from behind. The widow's breath caught. The ram. The mountain man raised his rifle and waited. He did not fire, not yet. He watched as the men came into view, 7 at first, then more. 10, just as he had said. They shouted to one another, voices harsh, carrying in the cold. They wanted her to hear. They wanted her fear. The ram thudded once into the snow, then again, closer. Her heart pounded with each step they took. The mountain man exhaled slow, steady, the rifle snug against his shoulder. They mean to break us, he said. But they've forgotten the mountain breaks back. When the men reached the yard, they paused, scanning the cabin. One called. Out, voice sharp. Come out, lawman. We know you're in there. Don't make us burn her roof to smoke you out. The widow flinched, but the mountain man did not move. He kept his eyes on the ram, on the limp-footed leader. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, and his breath came like smoke from a forge. Another voice rose. You can't keep her locked away. Winter kills faster than we do. The widow's hand found the bell, gripping it so tight her knuckles whitened. Her gaze darted to the mountain man, waiting for his signal, his voice, his plan. But he only crouched lower, eyes locked on the enemy, body tense as a bowstring. The men lifted the ram. Hi, their laughter cruel. The widow pressed her back to the wall, the child shifting inside her like it knew the danger pressed near. The moment stretched thin as glass. The first swing came, the log crashing against the door with a booming crack that shook the cabin walls. The beam held, but splinters flew. The widow gasped, her grip on the knife slick with sweat. The men roared, readying another strike. The mountain man lifted his rifle, steady as stone. He did not shoot yet. He waited, breath drawn, eyes narrowing as the second swing gathered. The sound of boots, the grunt of men, the ram rising high again. She felt the world tighten to a single point, the cabin trembling, the fire snapping low, her heart hammering loud enough to drown the wind. She looked at him and saw every scar, every shadow that had shaped him into what he was. She looked at the door and saw the line between life and loss. The second strike came down. The beam groaned. The men shouted louder. The widow raised the bell in her hand, the knife in the other, caught between the call to fight and the terror of what waited beyond. The mountain man's voice cut through the roar, low and fierce, carrying more weight than the crash of wood. Hold fast. The ram struck again. The cabin shuddered. The widow clutched the star with her eyes, the iron gleaming faintly in the dim. The men outside jeered, axes ready, torches raised. Smoke already licked at the wind. Every breath, every heartbeat pressed toward the edge of what must break. The door trembled. The fire hissed. The shadows swelled. She knew the next moment would split the world in two. The door shook once more, harder than before, the beam bending with a sound that made her blood run cold. Smoke swirled along the wind, the smell sharp and threatening. The widow braced herself, clutching the knife in one hand and the bell in the other, her heart thundering so loud she thought the men outside could hear it. Then came the thunder of a rifle. The mountain man fired at last, the shot cracking through the storm of noise. A scream followed, one of the men dropping to the snow. The ram faltered, the line of attackers stumbling as chaos split their rhythm. The mountain man did not waste a breath. He reloaded with the calm of a man who had done this before, each motion sure, steady, final. Another shot rang out, then another, each one snapping like a whip in the frozen air. The men outside howled, shouting curses, their confidence shaking, as blood marked the snow. The widow held her breath, pressing her back against the wall as the ram clattered uselessly to the ground. Torches hissed into the frost, men scrambling to drag the wounded away. The fire they had threatened sputtered before it could spread. Silence came again, broken only by the whimpers of retreating voices. The widow stared at the door, trembling, not sure if it was over or only paused. The mountain man set down the rifle, shoulders heaving once, but his eyes still sharp. "They'll think twice now," he said. "But fear doesn't last long in men like that. They'll either scatter or come back burning." She swallowed hard, the knife slipping from her hand to the floor. "How many more times can we hold them off?" "As many as it takes," he said. Yet even as he spoke, his gaze fell heavy. He had seen too many winters to believe courage alone could last forever. The night stretched on. Neither of them slept. She tended the fire while he kept watch at the window, the stolen rifle across his lap. Every flicker of shadow made her tense. Every whisper of the wind felt like footsteps. The baby inside her shifted, pressing against her ribs as though to remind her that time was not hers to spend. By dawn, the woods were still. No smoke rose, no laughter carried. The men had gone, or at least hidden. The widow dared to step outside, the frost biting her face. The snow was trampled, red stains marking where bodies had fallen, but no shape lay waiting. The yard was quiet, too quiet. She pulled her shawl tight and turned back. The mountain man standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the trees. Days passed without another attack. The mountain man scouted when he could, moving like a shadow through the timber. Each time he returned, his face said more than his words. The men had pulled back, leaving broken signs of camp, but he was not sure if they had given up or only waited for spring. Each day was a weight of silence and fear, but also a strange growing strength. She chopped wood, fetched water, and learned to steady her hands on the rifle when he showed her. At night, she dreamed of her husband's voice, then woke to the low rasp of the mountain man's breathing. The grief still lived in her, but so did something else now, something like steel forged from fire. One evening, as the sun bled red across the ridge, she found him sitting on the porch, sharpening his knife. He paused, staring out at the horizon, as though it held a memory too sharp to touch. She sat beside him, waiting, the silence stretching between them. At last he spoke. "I was a lawman once," he said. "Not here. Far east. Thought I could make men answer for the hurt they spread. But the world doesn't keep to laws, not out here. The one with the limp, he broke a town in half and left families ruined. I followed him here. Been following for years." She turned, her eyes to him, the truth settling heavy. "And now?" He set the knife down, his hands scarred, his voice quiet. "Now I've found something more worth standing for than chasing ghosts. That child of yours deserves a place where fire doesn't
rule."
"So do you." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but words failed. Instead, she laid her hand gently over his, the touch steady though her heart shook. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt not just fear of tomorrow, but a reason to meet it. Winter deepened. Snow walled them in, yet the threat of the men grew smaller with each silent day. Hunger would drive them elsewhere. The mountain man knew it, and the widow clung to the hope. Soon, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of fire and the low hum of life preparing to enter the world. When the time came, it was night. The storm howled against the walls, but inside the cabin another storm raged, one of pain and breath and new beginnings. The widow gritted her teeth, sweat on her brow, clutching the iron star with one hand as if its weight could steady her. The mountain man knelt beside her, his rough hands trembling for once as he helped. He spoke little, but his presence anchored her, each word of encouragement carrying the weight of promise. At last, the cry of a child filled the cabin, louder than the wind, sharper than fear. She held the newborn close, tears streaking her cheeks, her body weak but her spirit blazing. The mountain man leaned back, his face softened, eyes shining with something unspoken. "They'll live," he said quietly. "You'll live." In that moment, the war outside felt far away, the shadows beyond the ridge powerless. She looked at the child, then at him, and saw not just survival, but the start of a future she had thought lost as the months passed and spring thawed the land. The danger faded. Tracks in the snow vanished, camps were abandoned, and the limp-footed man was never seen again. Perhaps the mountain had claimed him, or perhaps he had fled too far to matter. It did not change what had been one. The cabin stood strong, scarred but whole. The widow's days filled with tending the baby, mending clothes, and learning the rhythms of the wild. The mountain man stayed, building new fences, clearing new ground, his silence less heavy now. When the child laughed for the first time, he turned away, wiping his eyes with a rough hand. But she saw. She began to understand that life was not about forgetting loss but carrying it alongside new joys. Her husband's memory lingered in quiet corners, yet it no longer chained her. She had found a strength born of fire, and with it she faced each sunrise. By summer, the land had softened. Flowers sprouted in the meadows, the streams ran full. The widow stood one morning with the baby in her arms, watching the mountain man repair the fence. His hair caught the light, silver in places, and his shoulders bent with work but unbroken. She realized then that the mountain, harsh as it was, had given her back more than it had taken. The danger had shaped them, but it had not ended them. They had learned that survival was not only about food and fire, but about standing together against the weight of fear. She whispered a quiet thanks to the mountain, to the star above the mantle, and to the man who had once growled a promise. At her door, the child cooed in her arms, reaching small fingers toward the sky. She smiled through tears, knowing that those storms would come again. They would face them with a strength forged in the hardest winter. The mountain was no longer only a place of loss and threat. It was home. And as the wind carried the scent of pine and earth across the yard, she felt peace settle at last. The story of fear and fire had ended, not with ash, but with the promise of life growing strong against the wild. Top of form, bottom of form.